So I was sitting in the bar last night with the Flex and talking about how you start the morning, and I thought, there's evaluation forms in front of you, so it's before 9 a.m., it's a Monday. Let me make myself popular by giving you a pop quiz. What I'd like you to do over the next 20 seconds is pick two people next to you and figure out in 20 seconds how many large US companies you can name that didn't exist 2 or 3 decades ago. Ready? Go. All right, time's up. Please, as a group, raise your hand if you could think of 5 companies. All right. Please raise your hand if you could think of 8 companies. There's a few. How about 10? There's a few there. How about 12? All right. Now let's try the second exercise in the next 20 seconds. Please do the same thing with large European companies that didn't exist 2 or 3 decades ago. Ready? Go. All right, time's up. How many of you could come up with 3? Raise your hands. 3? 5? Was that a little harder? So if you do this with a European audience, you actually get the same response. It's not just that you're not living in Europe. And it's not because there aren't great European brands. We like Ferragamo, and we like Gucci, and we like Louis Vuitton, and we like Ferrari, and the rest of the stuff. But there's a lot more churn in the US. So the companies in Europe are likely to be a couple hundred years old. It's likely to be the great-grandchildren that are running it. And in the US, what you have is this enormous wave of destruction, so that if you take the stock value of companies in 2000 and you let people work for 13 years, and they go in, they put in their 10 hours, and they do their weekends, and they do this, that, and the other, so 13 years worth of work, 3 companies are more valuable 13 years later, and all the rest are worth less or they have disappeared. And it's not just the management of these companies that's causing this, it's these new waves of companies that come in and they just wipe out the existing order. And that's the reason why 0.2% of US GDP is invested in venture capital, the stuff that I do, but it's 21% of US economic output. So the difference in job creation between the United States and economic creation between the United States and Spain and stuff is you have these waves of destruction, and what that does is it creates these systemic issues. And I want you to think about technology not as individual technologies, individual news stories. What I want to do in this first session is to tell you technology is something that is a systemic issue. Some of you may have heard of this little company called Uber. And you think that Uber is important because it affects taxi cab drivers and it makes it easier for you to get from X to Y. And you don't have a television blaring at you, and you don't have a plexiglass wall between it, and the driver is somebody you know. But that's not the issue with Uber, right? The issue with Uber is not just that it's worth more than everybody working in Uruguay for an entire year, every doctor, every bureaucrat, every inventor, every pilot. They work for an entire year. They're still not worth as much as Uber. The issue with Uber is when you couple it with another technology like an autonomous car, then things begin to get interesting, because then you've got a systemic effect. It's not just that you're creating one company, it's that you're going out and you're moving towards an autonomous vehicle. And oh, by the way, Tesla, because it's connected to the internet every night as you charge it, can upgrade its cars to 90% autonomous in a single night. So this isn't, there'll be generations of cars, and in 10 years, no, this is like one night you wake up and you've got a 90% autonomous car in every single Tesla. These are not gradual changes, these are step changes. And what does it mean to do that? Well, it means that we're going to see fully autonomous cars probably in the next 5 years. In fact, they're already driving millions of miles in California. And if you have an Uber, you're already driving much less. Why? Because if you drive less than 10,000 miles, by the time you take into account parking and insurance and the cost of buying a car, etc., it just makes more sense to Uber than it does to buy a car. And that's the reason why a lot of grandkids are not even getting their driver's license at 16 or 18 or 19. In fact, Uber users are 22% less likely to buy a car today. So as this thing moves forward, an autonomous Uber will cost 50% less than today's Ubers. And at that point, it just doesn't make sense to drive or buy a car. And so the impact of this stuff is many of our grandchildren will never get a license. Right? So as you move this stuff forward, what else does that mean? Well, that means that used car sales goes away. As you think of all those like used car and new car lots, they all go away. Because 95% of people won't buy a car for themselves. Double parking goes away. That one idiot who blocks an entire lane for 1 second, right? Because I'm just going to drop this off. They're blocking a half of the roadway for their convenience. Well, that goes away. And oh, by the way, so does on-street parking. There's no reason to park on the street. There's no reason to have parking lots. All the parking lots get repurposed. And by the way, in Los Angeles, you've got about 3.2 parking spaces per car. That all comes back to the city. That all comes back to real estate. It begins to redesign cities, begins to redesign sidewalks, begins to redesign cafes, does away with very large industries, and it's the second largest consumer item for most people during their lives. It also decreases commuting times, because there isn't that one Twinkie who doesn't know how to merge, or who's driving 30 miles an hour. Right? And as that goes away, all of a sudden you don't need these enormous infrastructure projects, and you need less cement, you need less engineers for construction, you need less bridges. So these are enormous systemic ripple effects, but you're just reading the one news story, right? Uber grew, or Uber got financed, or taxi drivers are mad at Uber. What I want you to understand is we're not even going to have these lawyers, which I know brings tears to your eyes. So autonomous cars are coming. They're coming very quickly. They're decreasing car purchases. You can substitute all cabs in the United States with about 171,000 autonomous cars. The number of cars sold will likely drop by about 90%. There'll be no car parking lots, insurance, used car sales. We lose about 10 million jobs. Transport infrastructure, cement all begin to restructure. Cities begin to restructure, and towns begin to restructure. All because of two companies. So instead of reading technology stuff as individual packets, what I want you to understand is technology is something that takes companies that are great, big, established companies that have beautiful portraits of the founders inside them, and they just overwhelm them with technology, and usually companies have no idea of what hit them because they don't understand these systemic effects. And by the way, that drives almost all new job creation in the United States. So as you're thinking of these structures, we have to think of organizing people differently. Because for most of history, people were cogs in a machine. They were slaves. They were peasants. You drove them. You didn't increase the productivity per person. What the first assembly line, this one at Ford, did is it began to organize people to make the same thing. And what do you want in an assembly line? You don't want anybody who's creative. It really doesn't matter if the person's name is Tom, Dick, or Harry, as long as the person puts the right screw in the right place at the right time and doesn't get creative. And by the way, that worked pretty well because you got a 55-fold increase in productivity. Not 55%, 55 times. But what's happened recently is instead of having organizations that look like this and like that, everybody dressed the same, one woman in the crowd white shirts, blue ties. You're beginning to have jobs where people want problems. People want to solve problems. They see a great big problem, big business. And as you're looking at this stuff, you begin to organize in networks, not in hierarchies. And if you organize in networks, you get some really interesting technology because all of a sudden you organize people not in a pyramid but in a network, and you plug in these printers that look pretty primitive, that don't make pretty things, but printers get bigger, printers get smaller, printers get more accurate, they begin to make things that it's hard for humans to make, they begin to make all kinds of pieces. You can print these things in 4 hours, you can print an automobile in 4 hours. You begin to have printer cafes in Tokyo where kids are showing each other how to print in paper, in wood, in metal, in a whole series of things. And all of a sudden, these things come to your house. And they look like Bang & Olufsen turntables. And guess what? I'm missing this little piece from my glasses. Fine, you print it. You don't go to the hardware store. I'm missing this little piece where my grandchild just made this. They fax it to you, and it comes up as a 3D object. And that begins to change things because when the first people got a Tesla, after waiting for a long time, they drive over to the Starbucks feeling like $1 million, buy a cup of coffee and go, whoops. Why? Because there was no cup holder in the Tesla. So what happens at General Motors? They go back to General Motors, they tell the General Motors person, hey, there's no cup holder. Person comes out puzzled, checks, yes, there's no cup holder, reports to headquarters. Headquarters says, yes, there's no cup holder. There should be a cup holder. They ask for a budget for a design of a cup holder. They take it to the auto fair a year later. They approve a change in the production line. They come back with a change in the production line. 3 years later, you've got your cup holder. What the Tesla owner does is the Tesla owner goes, designs a 3D printer at home, has a cup holder and a telephone holder, prints the thing, puts it in his automobile, and uploads the file. Which means that afternoon, everybody who's got a Tesla can print their own cup holder, and they're no longer asking the company for permission. And so all of a sudden what you're doing here is all of a sudden you're structuring this in such a way that the person who owns the design of the product is the person, the client. And the company better listen very carefully to how clients are restructuring the thing, because not only do they have 3D printers, they've also got robots, and they can program these robots. And this particular robot, designed by Rodney Brooks, works 24/7, doesn't take Social Security, doesn't take vacation days, can be programmed by anybody by holding their arms, ships today for $22,000. And that's going to make the US and Europe low-cost manufacturing centers, and it's going to shift who makes things where what. You can do the same thing with houses. You can build houses in 2 days, or you can build 5-story apartments in 2 days. And as this stuff begins to move forward, let me just give you an example of how this works. So this little kid shows up in my office and says, hi, I just graduated from MIT in electrical engineering, aerospace engineering. Oh, good for you. And I'd like to build a flying car. Oh, sure, kid. You in what army? You're going to take on Boeing and General Motors? Yes, because I've got a decentralized network. I've got fabricators here. I've got designers over here. Okay. 2 years later, there's a car. It's on FAA trials. And believe me, it's a lot cooler to show up at the golf course in a flying car than in your Ferrari. So here's 5 major changes over the next 30 years. Network forces quickly overwhelm corporations. And if you can name 10 or 12 new companies today, you're going to name 20 or 30 in the next 10 years. And a bunch of companies that you take as blue chips are going to vaporize. The second thing is 3D printing and robots are going to decentralize manufacturing and design. The fourth is you're going to get a very fast build and redesign. All of a sudden, what's going to start happening is you're going to begin to get a whole series of people, customers, redesigning cars, redesigning the way the car looks, the way the car acts, and companies better listen very carefully to that. Everything's going to be $2 a kilo. A printer really doesn't care if it's making a Volkswagen or a Ferrari. And the US and the EU are going to become low-cost manufacturing centers. So these are systemic changes. These aren't just things that happened to come around. Now, I was going to tell you about gene research, but because we only have 15 minutes, that's where I'm going to leave it. But if you'd like to follow on gene research, Randy has a bunch of books on evolving ourselves, because if there's any systemic change that's going to make this stuff look simple, it's going to be the ability to redesign life. If you think this is impactful, the ability to say, I am going to redesign a life form to make this or to make that is going to double your lifespan, is going to change medicine, is going to change chemicals, is going to change agriculture. It's going to be the biggest single change on the planet. And if you think that's an exaggeration, think of somebody standing on this stage circa 1976, 1980, telling you the single biggest change is going to be the ability to write in ones and zeros. And many in this room might have said, no, that's just for computer geeks. No, it's not. It's changed every single aspect of society. And the biggest single change is going to be from redesigning life forms using gene code, life code. Thank you all very much.